What if the toughest billionaire in the city, feared in boardrooms, unyielding in every deal, was also a woman who hadn't taken a single step in years? And what if the one person she couldn't push away wasn't a lawyer, a doctor, or a rival, but a broke single-dad veteran with nothing left to lose? That way, you'll never miss the ones that just might stay in your heart long after they end. Mason Cole knelt on the plush white carpet, his calloused hands working the damp cloth in short, desperate strokes. The rich scent of freshly brewed coffee hung in the air, mingling with the sharp tang of the cleaning solution. He had fought in places where dust and blood stained the ground beyond redemption, but now he was battling a stubborn brown blotch spreading across the heart of a billionaire's immaculate living room. His long hair fell forward, brushing the hollow of his cheeks. Shadows under his eyes hinted at too many sleepless nights. Every motion was careful, restrained, as if each press of the cloth carried the weight of his survival. Across the room, Kara Kingsley sat perfectly still in her sleek black wheelchair. Sunlight from the floor-to-ceiling windows framed her like a portrait, catching the gold in her hair and the sharp lines of her tailored blouse. Her gaze was cool, detached, assessing him as though she had seen 100 others like him, people who lasted a day, maybe less. Kara didn't believe in second chances, not for herself, not for anyone. Her voice broke the silence, smooth but laced with steel. "You can leave right now, or stay and endure me for another hour." The room seemed to still. Even the faint hum of the air conditioning felt muted. Mason's jaw tightened. He knew the type. Powerful, guarded, quick to push away anyone who might step too close. He had met generals like that. He had been one, once. But before he could answer, a small voice piped up. Ellie stepped forward from where she had been quietly watching. At 8 years old, she was all bright eyes and delicate hands, a contrast to the tension in the room. She carried something in her palm, a tiny carved wooden bird, its wings outstretched mid-flight. Without hesitation, she crossed the expanse of expensive carpet and placed it gently on the glass coffee table in front of Kara. "This will help you feel safer," she said simply. Kara's hand hovered above the little bird, her expression unreadable. The carving was worn smooth in places, as if it had been held often, for comfort. Mason straightened slowly, his body tense. Ellie wasn't supposed to cross boundaries like that. He had taught her to keep her distance, to respect other people's space, especially here, where one wrong move could cost him the job he badly needed. But Kara didn't tell her to take it back. She didn't call for security. She simply stared at the bird, then at Ellie, and finally, at Mason. Something flickered in her eyes, not warmth, not yet, but not the cold certainty of dismissal either, a crack in the armor. "You carry this with you?" she asked, her tone softer than before. Ellie nodded. "It used to help my dad when he had bad dreams. Now it helps me too." The words hung in the air. Mason could feel Kara studying him, as if weighing more than just his ability to clean carpets. For a moment, the vast, modern living room felt smaller, quieter, like a place where people might actually talk, instead of just endure each other's presence. Kara's lips pressed together. She rolled the little bird between her fingers once, then set it back down on the table. "Fine," she said, her voice regaining a hint of its earlier edge. "You can stay. For now." It wasn't gratitude. It wasn't trust. But it wasn't the firing he had expected either. Mason inclined his head slightly. "Thank you." Kara looked at him for a beat longer, then turned her chair toward the massive windows, her posture signaling the conversation was over. But Mason noticed her glancing sideways at Ellie, as if the child had breached a wall she had long believed impenetrable. Ellie returned to her father's side, her hand brushing his. He didn't scold her, not this time, because deep down, Mason knew Something had shifted, and for reasons she probably couldn't even name, Kara Kingsley had not told them to leave. The rest of the hour passed in silence, but not the hostile kind Mason had felt in the beginning. Kara busied herself with documents on her lap desk, occasionally glancing toward the coffee table where the little bird now rested. Mason finished cleaning, his movements unhurried but precise. He noticed the way the sun moved across the room, spilling light over the carved wings. He wondered if Kara would keep it there after they left, or if it would be quietly returned the next time they came. Ellie hummed softly to herself, a tune Mason recognized, one she used to sing to him when he woke from nightmares, not the other way around. He thought about the bills waiting on his kitchen counter, about the messages from the landlord, about the 2 other jobs he was working to keep them afloat. This was supposed to be temporary, but temporary might just turn into something else if he could keep Kara from deciding otherwise. And Mason, who had fought battles that left scars both visible and not, knew that sometimes the real fight wasn't about winning. It was about staying in the room long enough for something to change. When they finally stepped out into the crisp afternoon air, Ellie slipped her small hand into his. "I think she liked it," she said. Mason glanced at her. "The bird." She nodded. "And you?" He didn't answer, but in the reflection of the glass door behind them, he caught a glimpse of Kara at the window, watching them leave. Her expression was still guarded, but her gaze lingered a little too long to be pure indifference. Inside, the little wooden bird remained on the table. And for Kara Kingsley, who didn't believe in second chances, the day had ended with her giving one. The next morning, Mason arrived at the Kingsley estate before the sun had fully climbed over the horizon. The sprawling glass and stone mansion looked cold against the pale dawn sky, like a fortress untouched by time or weather. He knew why he was here, and it wasn't because this was his dream job. His custody hearing was 3 weeks away, and his lawyer had made it clear. Stable employment would strengthen his case. Losing this job before then could tip the scales in the wrong direction. Inside, the air smelled faintly of cedar and polish. Everything was immaculate to the point of sterility. Kara's household didn't run on normal rules. It ran on her rules. Rules that, according to the whispered warnings of other staff, had sent more than a dozen housekeepers packing in under an hour. He hadn't been there a full minute before the list appeared. One of the assistants, a sharp-eyed woman in a navy pencil skirt, handed him a printed sheet. "From Ms. Kingsley," she said, her tone suggesting she expected him to fail. He scanned it. Rule 1. Water for mopping must be exactly 118 degrees Fahrenheit, measured, not guessed. Rule 2. All towels folded into perfect thirds, edges aligned, stacked no higher than 7 inches. Rule 3. No touching, moving, or cleaning anything on her desk. Ever. There were 15 more, each more exacting than the last. Mason exhaled slowly, resisting the urge to crumple the paper. He had seen military manuals less precise. By mid-morning, he was already feeling the pressure. Every task felt like walking a tightrope with no safety net. He filled the mop bucket, checking the thermometer twice. He folded towels so meticulously his fingers cramped. But the desk rule, that was the one that stuck in his head. Kara's office was on the 2nd floor, a sleek space of dark wood and glass with a view of the sprawling gardens. The door was usually shut, and when she was inside, no one entered without being summoned. So when Mason walked past that afternoon and saw the door slightly ajar, his instincts told him to keep moving. Until he noticed Ellie. She was perched on a chair beside Kara's desk, legs swinging gently, her small hands folded in her lap. She wasn't touching anything, but her gaze was fixed on Kara in a way that made Mason's chest tighten. Kara was leaning forward, scanning something on her laptop. Her jaw was set, but her eyes betrayed something else. Ellie spoke softly, almost like she didn't want anyone else to hear. "You're worried about them taking something from you." Kara's head snapped up. For a heartbeat, the room froze. Mason stepped forward, ready to pull Ellie away, but Kara's gaze cut to him. Sharp warning. "She's fine," Kara said, her tone unreadable. Ellie tilted her head. "It's not about money, is it? It's about someone not keeping their promise." The air seemed to thicken. Mason's gut clenched. Ellie had that way of reading people, of peeling back layers without trying. It was a gift he didn't fully understand, and one he sometimes wished she didn't have, because not everyone wanted to be seen that clearly. Kara's fingers tapped once on the desk. Her eyes, however, didn't leave Ellie's face. "You're very perceptive," she said finally. The words were neutral, but there was a flicker, something like surprise, maybe even respect, buried in her tone. Then it was gone. She leaned back, her expression shuddered. "Mason, your daughter should probably be with you while you work." It wasn't a dismissal, but it wasn't an invitation either. Ellie slid off the chair, glancing back at Kara with a faint smile. "It's okay. I hope it works out." As they walked away, Mason could feel Kara's eyes on them. Not the watchful, suspicious gaze from yesterday, but something more complicated. He didn't know if that was better or worse. Back in the hallway, Mason crouched, so he was eye level with Ellie. "You can't just say things like that to people you've just met," he murmured. Ellie shrugged, her small voice steady. "She needed someone to say it, I could tell." Mason didn't argue, because deep down, he knew Ellie was right, and that might be the most dangerous thing about all of this. By the end of the day, Mason had followed every one of Kara's rules to the letter. The towels were perfect, the floors gleamed, and her desk was untouched. But he had the uneasy feeling that the real test wasn't in the list she'd given him, it was in the moments she hadn't written down. And today, Ellie had stumbled straight into one. By the end of their first week at the Kingsley estate, Mason had learned two things. First, Kara's rules weren't just rules, they were a kind of armor. Second, the house itself had a rhythm, quiet and measured, but not without its strange undercurrents. It was Saturday morning when Ellie said it. They were in the small kitchen off the east wing, where staff took their breaks. Mason was rinsing dishes from their breakfast when she leaned against the counter, eyes darting toward the hallway. "Dad," she whispered, "there's someone here who makes secret phone calls." Mason paused. "What do you mean?" She lowered her voice even further. "Every time Miss Kingsley is in her office, or busy with someone else, I see him in the garden. He talks really fast. He looks around before he answers the phone, like he doesn't want anyone to hear." He straightened slowly, wiping his hands on a towel. "Who?" Ellie hesitated, then nodded toward the back door, where a tall, thin man in a pressed grey suit was carrying a folder toward the guest house. It was Gerald, one of Kara's senior administrative aides. Mason had barely spoken to him beyond polite greetings, but something about the man had always seemed calculated. Ellie's eyes were serious. "I think he's telling someone things he's not supposed to." Mason didn't answer right away. He'd learned over the years, both in the military and out, that kids saw things adults often missed. And Ellie, with her uncanny sense for people, wasn't the type to make wild claims. Still, accusing someone without proof could blow up in ways he couldn't afford, especially here, especially with Kara. He crouched so they were eye level. "Ellie, if you see him again, don't get close, just let me handle it." Her brows furrowed. "You're not going to tell Miss Kingsley?" "Not yet," Mason said. "If I'm wrong, it'll make things worse for everyone. If I'm right, I'll need proof." Ellie nodded slowly, but her eyes searched his face. "I don't like secrets." "Neither do I," he said, though he knew that wasn't entirely true. Sometimes secrets kept people safe, At least until you were ready to act. The next few days unfolded at a gentler pace. The autumn light slanted differently through the mansion's wide windows, softening the sharp edges of Kara's world. Mason and Ellie began to slip into the estate's rhythm. Early mornings in the kitchen, afternoons cleaning the east wing, evenings walking the garden paths when Kara was done with meetings. Ellie found her own small corners of comfort. She liked the sunroom, with its overstuffed chairs and shelves of books that smelled faintly of lavender. Sometimes Mason would find her there, curled up with a book far too advanced for her age, or sketching quietly in her worn notebook. For Mason, the moments of stillness were both a relief and a danger. He could feel the guardrails of his life shifting, less survival, more observation. And in that stillness, Gerald's presence became sharper, more deliberate. Twice, Mason caught sight of him stepping out onto the far terrace, phone pressed tightly to his ear. Once, Gerald's eyes had flicked toward the main house before he moved behind the tall hedges. The second time, Mason had been cleaning windows on the second floor. From his vantage point, he could see Gerald's posture, tense, head tilted slightly as though listening to instructions. He wanted to storm down there, demand answers, drag the truth out of the man. But a voice in his head, one honed by years in uniform, told him to wait. Timing was everything. You didn't move until you had the terrain mapped, the exits clear, and the evidence you couldn't be argued away. Still, it gnawed at him. Every day he delayed was another day Kara might be losing something she couldn't get back. One evening, Mason was polishing the dining room table when Kara entered. She wheeled herself to the far end, glancing at the smooth surface. "No streaks," she said, almost to herself. Mason straightened. "I'm learning." Her eyes lifted to his. "That's more than most people do around here." There was no smile, but the faintest shift in her tone. Less ice, more acknowledgement. Mason was about to step aside when Gerald appeared in the doorway. "Miss Kingsley," Gerald said smoothly. "A call for you in the study, overseas line." Kara nodded and turned her chair. Gerald's gaze swept over Mason for a fraction of a second, assessing, maybe even measuring, before he followed her out. Ellie slipped into the room moments later, holding a sketch pad. "He was on the phone again," she whispered. Mason's jaw tightened. He didn't need her to say who he was. That night, after Ellie was asleep, Mason sat in the small staff lounge with a cup of coffee gone lukewarm. The choice weighed on him. Go to Kara now, risk being dismissed as paranoid, or watch, wait, and gather proof. He chose the latter. It was a decision that would divide anyone who heard the story. Some would say he was protecting Kara by not going to her without evidence. Others would argue that waiting was a risk she couldn't afford. But Mason knew his reason. Trust, once broken, was almost impossible to rebuild. And if he was going to ask Kara to trust him, he needed to be certain. The morning had begun quietly, the way most did at the Kingsley estate. Sunlight spilled across the polished floor of the grand living room, catching the edges of the framed art Kara had chosen herself. Each piece carefully placed, each line intentional. Mason had just finished dusting the far shelves when his gaze landed on an empty spot. He hesitated only a second before reaching into his bag. The frame was worn, the wood chipped at one corner, but the photograph inside was bright with life. Mason in uniform, his arm around a smiling woman, Ellie grinning between them with baby teeth showing. He set it on the shelf, just beside a vase of pale orchids. For him, it wasn't decoration. It was a reminder of what he'd lost and what he still had to fight for. He stepped back, studying it for a moment. The room felt warmer with it there. That warmth lasted exactly 6 minutes. The whir of Kara's wheelchair echoed from the hallway before she appeared. her gaze sweeping the room in its usual practiced scan. But when her eyes landed on the photograph, her entire expression shifted. "What is that?" she asked, voice sharp enough to cut glass. Mason straightened. "It's mine. I thought it... You thought you could put your personal items in my living room." The cool precision of her words was more dangerous than if she'd shouted. "This is my home, Mr. Cole. Every inch of it is intentional. You don't get to alter it." He blinked at her, caught between disbelief and rising heat in his chest. "It's just a photo. My family. It's not hurting anyone." Her eyes hardened. "It's in my space. That makes it my business. Remove it. Now." Something inside Mason snapped. Weeks of walking on eggshells, of following absurd rules, of swallowing his instincts. It all rushed to the surface. "With all due respect, Kara, space isn't just walls and furniture," he said, his voice low but edged. "It's the people in it. You hired me to be here, to take care of this place, to take care of..." He stopped short, jaw tightening. "But you treat every human being like a piece of furniture you can move at will." Her fingers gripped the armrest of her chair. "You're crossing a line, Mr. Cole." "Maybe the line needs crossing," he shot back. "You think you're untouchable, but you're just... alone. And the only reason you've kept people here this long is because they're paid to stay. But people don't stay where they're not wanted, Kara." Her face went pale, not with shock, but with something closer to fury. "Get out." The words hung between them like a slammed door. Mason took a step forward, his hands curling into fists at his sides. "Is that what you want? Because I can walk away, right now." For a moment, she looked ready to say yes. The air was so tight between them it felt like the walls might crack. Then a small voice came from the doorway. "If Dad goes," Ellie said, her tone steady but her eyes wide, "who will protect you?" Both adults turned. Ellie stood just inside the room, clutching her little wooden bird in both hands. Her gaze was fixed on Kara, not Mason. Kara's lips parted, but no sound came out. Ellie took a step closer. "I've seen the way people talk to you when they think you're not listening. I've seen Gerald in the garden on the phone. Dad's the only one here who isn't afraid to stand up for you." Silence stretched. The only sound was the faint hum of the heating system. Kara's expression shifted, just slightly, enough for Mason to see a crack in the wall she kept around herself. Finally, she looked at the photograph again. Her voice, when it came, was quieter. "Take it to your quarters." "Not here." It wasn't an apology, but it wasn't a dismissal either. Mason nodded once, picking up the frame. He felt Ellie's eyes on him as he left the room, his heart still thudding in his chest. That night, as he set the photo on the small dresser in their quarters, Mason thought about how close he'd come to walking out. Kara's rules might have been a fortress, but for the first time, he wondered if that fortress was less about control and more about fear. And if Ellie could see it, maybe he could too. The rain came in sheets that night, drumming against the tall windows of the Kingsley estate. Mason had just finished securing the patio furniture when he passed Kara's study. The door was half open, warm light spilling into the hallway. She was there, alone, her wheelchair turned toward the window, as if watching the storm. But Mason noticed her hands, twisting a silver bracelet over and over. It wasn't the same steely, untouchable Kara he'd come to know. "You should close the blinds," he said gently, leaning in the doorway. "The wind might push rain inside." She didn't turn. "I like to watch it. Makes the house feel less empty." The word hung in the air. Mason hesitated, then stepped inside. "You want me to leave?" For once, she didn't tell him yes. Instead, she reached to the side table. Resting there was the small wooden bird Ellie had given her days ago. Kara's fingers traced its carved wings, almost absently. "She said it would help me feel safe," Kara murmured. "I thought it was silly. But—" She paused, then looked at him, her eyes softer than he'd ever seen. "It's strange. When it's near, I don't feel abandoned." The admission caught Mason off guard. "I'm glad it means something to you. Ellie, she notices things most people miss." Kara's gaze drifted back to the storm. "It reminds me of before." "Before what?" he asked quietly. Her jaw tightened, but she didn't look away from the rain. "Before the accident. 3 years ago. I was supposed to speak at a charity gala. I never made it there." She took a slow breath. "The police called it an unfortunate chain of events. Brake failure, a slick road. But I'd had the car service the day before. My uncle insisted on handling it through his trusted mechanic. A month later, he was on the board of my company, and I was in this chair." Mason's hands curled into fists at his sides. "You think he—" "I don't think," she interrupted. "I know, but proving it is another matter. And until I do, he's still there, making decisions that don't belong to him." The quiet fury in her voice was something Mason recognized. The same tone soldiers used when talking about betrayals they couldn't forgive. He'd heard it in the barracks, in the desert night. "I get it," he said finally. "Afghanistan taught me that the worst wounds aren't always visible, and sometimes the enemy isn't where you expect them to be." She looked at him then. Really looked. "You served there." "2 tours," he said. "Last one ended with my unit pinned down in a small village. We'd been sent to protect civilians during an evacuation. My best friend, Mark, was on point. He spotted a boy, maybe 10, trapped in a collapsed building. Went in after him. I followed." He paused, the storm outside filling the silence. "We got the kid out, but a secondary blast hit before Mark could clear the doorway. I was 2 steps too far away to reach him. I still hear it at night. That moment I didn't make it. Kara didn't speak right away, but the guarded look she usually wore had shifted into something else, recognition. "You carry that," she said quietly. "Every day," Mason admitted, "and I'd give anything to change it. But you can't change the past. You can only decide what kind of person you're going to be now." Her eyes dropped to the wooden bird again. "And what kind of person are you now, Mr. Cole?" "The kind who doesn't walk away when someone's in trouble," he said simply. "Even if they'd rather push me out the door." Something flickered in her expression, half amusement, half something warmer. She set the wooden bird back on the table, closer to her than before. "You should know," she said at last. "If you keep staying in this house, you'll find yourself in trouble too." Mason gave a small, wry smile. "Then I guess I'm in the right place." Outside, the rain eased, and for the first time, Mason felt the air between them shift, not into trust exactly, but into a fragile truce, and for now, that was enough. The morning started with the sharp, clipped sound of Kara's phone slamming onto her desk. Mason had been polishing the hallway banister when he heard it. A moment later, the door to her study burst open. "Cancel the meeting," she barked at her assistant, who scrambled after her. "And get the board on the line, now." She didn't see Mason watching from the shadows. Kara's face was pale, her knuckles white around the wheels of her chair. "What happened?" he asked, stepping forward. "Nothing you need to concern yourself with," she said without slowing. "Focus on cleaning the East Wing." But Mason had learned enough about her to hear what wasn't being said. That wasn't nothing. That was damage control. By noon, the staff was whispering in corners. Bits of conversation floated past him as he worked. Words like breach of contract, loss of investors, and emergency vote. The pattern was clear. Someone had pulled the rug out from under Kara, and they'd done it fast. Ellie found him in the kitchen. her little hands clutching the wooden bird Cora kept in her study. "She looked sad today," she said, "like when you got that letter about court." Mason took the carving, running a thumb over its smooth wings. "She's in a fight, Ellie, and I don't think she even knows who she's fighting." But Mason had an idea, and it started with a name he hadn't spoken in years: Captain Ryan Hale. Ryan had been his commanding officer in Afghanistan, a man who knew how to read a battlefield, or a corporate chessboard. After the war, Ryan had moved into the world of private security consulting, specializing in corporate risk assessments. If anyone could dig into Kara's latest disaster, it was him. That evening, when the estate settled into quiet, Mason stepped out onto the back terrace with his phone. He hesitated before dialing, because what he was about to do might cross more than one line. Ryan picked up on the second ring. "Cole, hell, I thought you were buried somewhere in the Midwest fixing tractors." "Not quite," Mason said. "I'm working for someone who just had a major contract collapse. High profile. I need to know who pulled the trigger." "You realize," Ryan said slowly, "that corporate sabotage is a legal minefield. You planning to get me into trouble?" "I'm planning to stop someone from destroying the only person standing between my kid and a world of hurt." There was a pause. "Send me the contract details. And Cole, this better not come back on you. Or me." When Mason hung up, the air felt heavier. He was officially stepping into Kara's war without her permission. The next day, he shadowed the delivery trucks that came through the front gates. On the surface, it was part of his job, overseeing maintenance schedules, checking the loading area. But really, he was watching for one particular car. At 11:47 a.m. it arrived, a sleek black sedan, tinted windows. Gerald, Kara's uncle, stepped out, shaking hands with a man Mason recognized from the investor list Ryan had sent him overnight. The man wasn't just any investor. He was also tied to a competitor who had been circling Kara's company for months. Mason moved closer, careful to keep to the cover of the stone archway. "Told you she'd fold under pressure," Gerald was saying, his voice low but sharp. "Once the board votes, the company is ours. Keep your end of the deal, and there's a seat waiting for you." Mason's stomach tightened. It was confirmation. Gerald was engineering her downfall. But before he could get closer, a voice behind him cut the air. "What are you doing?" He turned. Kara was there, eyes narrowed, her assistant hovering nervously behind her. "Just making sure deliveries are handled right," Mason said smoothly. "Don't," she snapped. "Whatever you think you're doing, stay out of it." "I can handle my own battles." Her words were ice, but Mason could see the flicker of fear behind them. "With all due respect," he said quietly, "someone in your circle doesn't want you to win, and you're letting them write the rules." "That's not your decision to make," she fired back. Ellie's voice drifted from the steps above them. "Daddy, is everything okay?" Mason forced a smile up at her. "Go inside, Ellie. I'll be right there." Kara's gaze followed the girl, her expression unreadable. "You keep pushing like this," she warned, "and you'll leave me no choice but to make sure you're gone before the week's over." But Mason had already made his choice. The storm had hit, and he wasn't about to let her face it alone, whether she wanted him there or not. The rain started just after midnight, a steady drumming on the estate's slate roof. Mason sat at the kitchen table, the house dark except for the yellow cone of light spilling from a single lamp. Ryan's latest report lay open in front of him, pages of call logs, bank transfers, and surveillance notes. One name was circled in red: Margaret Holloway. Mason knew the name well. Margaret had been with the Kingsley family for over 20 years, head housekeeper, gatekeeper, and, according to the staff, Kara's last line of personal defense. Mason had seen the way Kara leaned on her, the way she took her coffee only from Margaret's hands. And yet, there it was in black and white. Dozens of late-night calls to Gerald's office, transfers to an account offshore, timed just after keyboard meetings. The pattern was undeniable. By dawn, Mason had made up his mind. He found Margaret in the linen room, carefully stacking freshly laundered towels. The scent of lavender drifted from the warm cotton. "Margaret," he said evenly, closing the door behind him, "we need to talk." She looked up, surprise flickering across her lined face. "About what, Mr. Cole?" He tossed the file onto the counter between them, pages fanned out, her name staring back in red ink. "About this. About why you've been feeding Kara's uncle information that's bleeding her company dry." Her eyes darted over the papers, then back to him. "You've been spying on me." "I've been protecting her," Mason shot back. "And I thought you were too." A brittle silence stretched between them before Margaret let out a low, humorless laugh. "Protecting her? Is that what you think you're doing?" "I know that's what I'm doing." She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a hiss. "She doesn't know how to protect herself, never has. That girl thinks the world plays fair. I'm making sure she doesn't end up penniless and broken when the board finally tears her apart." "By handing her enemies the knife," Mason demanded. Margaret's jaw tightened. "Better they cut her down quick than watch her cling to a dream she can't win. At least this way, she'll still have money left. A life left." "That's not your choice to make," Mason said, his voice sharp. "It's hers." The door swung open. Kara sat there in her wheelchair, framed by the doorway. She'd heard enough. "Is it true?" she asked, her voice calm but deadly. Margaret's expression shifted. Guilt, defiance, something else Mason couldn't name. "Everything I've done was to keep you safe." "Safe?" Kara's tone was ice. "You've been selling me out. To him." Kara didn't raise her voice, but the crack in it was worse than shouting. "Leave. Now." Margaret hesitated, her eyes pleading for understanding, but Kara's stare didn't waver. She brushed past Mason, her shoulder grazing his as she left the room for the last time. When they were alone, Kara wheeled toward Mason. Her voice was low, but vibrating with anger. "You went through my staff without my permission. I found the person who's been sabotaging you. You crossed a line," she snapped. "Do you think you're the only one who's ever protected me? You've been here, what, weeks? I've lived like this for years." Mason clenched his fists, fighting the urge to argue. "If I'd waited for your permission, she'd still be here, feeding your uncle everything." "You don't understand," Kara said, her voice tightening. "Trust isn't something I can give lightly, and you just tore apart the one person I thought I could rely on." Mason stared at her, stunned. "She was betraying you, Kara." "And now so are you," she said, and the words hit harder than any punch he'd taken in uniform. The rest of the day passed in silence. Kara shut herself in her study. The staff moved like ghosts. Even Ellie sensed the tension, clinging to her father's side without asking questions. That night, Mason packed a duffel. He told himself it was temporary, that he was giving her space. But deep down, the truth gnawed at him. Maybe she was right. Maybe he'd overstepped. Ellie sat on the bed, watching him fold his last shirt. "Are we leaving?" she asked quietly. He hesitated. "We might be." She hugged the wooden bird to her chest. "But if we leave, who's going to help her?" Mason swallowed hard. He didn't have an answer. The letter came in a thin, cream-colored envelope, with the county seal stamped in black. Mason knew before he opened it. The hearing date, moved up by 2 weeks. The words, "environment deemed unstable for minor," burned in his vision. His lawyer's warning echoed in his mind. Any hint of conflict, police involvement, or erratic employment will work against you. And here he was, living in a billionaire's mansion wrapped in corporate intrigue, with more shouting matches than peaceful nights, exactly the kind of instability the court would seize on. Ellie's future hung in the balance. He sat in the cab of his truck outside the courthouse, fingers tightening around the steering wheel. He could drive straight to his lawyer's office, cut ties, build a case for stability, protect himself. But when he closed his eyes, it wasn't the image of a courtroom that came to him. It was Kara. Her face the night she'd admitted the accident, the tremor in her voice when she said she didn't want to be left behind. The rare, unguarded moments when she'd let him see past the armor. And for the first time, Mason realized it wasn't just about keeping Ellie anymore. He wanted to protect Kara. Not as a job, not as leverage for court, but because somewhere between her sharp edges and his stubborn walls, he'd started to care. He put the truck in gear and turned toward the Kingsley estate. The mansion's front gates stood open. That alone was wrong. Kara never left them open. Mason killed the engine halfway up the drive and moved on foot, every sense sharpened. From the open doors of the great hall, voices spilled out. One smooth and venomous, the other taut with fury. "Sign it, Kara." Gerald's voice was low, almost intimate in its menace. "Sell the company while you still have a choice, or the board will strip it from you in the vote next week, and then you'll be left with nothing but your pretty little house and your pity." Mason stepped inside. Kara sat in her wheelchair at the long oak table, a document spread before her. Gerald loomed over her, pen in hand. 2 board members stood by the windows, watching with carefully neutral faces. "You think threatening me will make me trust you?" Kara shot back. "You're worse than the shareholders. At least they stabbed me in the front." Gerald's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Don't flatter yourself. This isn't personal. It's business. And right now, you're bad for business." Kara's hand hovered near the pen. "Don't," Mason said, his voice cutting across the room. All eyes turned. Gerald's mouth curled into stain. "And here's the janitor. Come to polish the floors while the grown-ups talk." Mason didn't rise to the bait. He walked forward, a folder in his hand. "No. I came to make sure you don't sign away the one thing you fought your whole life to keep." "Mason," Kara began, but he shook his head. He opened the folder and laid out photographs, call logs, and transaction slips on the table. "This is proof that your trusted housekeeper was feeding Gerald insider information for months. Bank transfers to an offshore account linked to him. Times, dates, amounts, all here." One of the board members stepped closer, brows knitting. "Is this authentic?" "Every line," Mason said. "And I'll swear to it in court if I have to." Gerald's face tightened. "This is a fabrication. Funny," Mason said evenly, "because I got half of it from your own company email. Guess your IT department isn't as loyal as you thought." The board members exchanged glances. One of them, Patel, Kara had mentioned him before, spoke up. "If this is true, it's a breach of fiduciary duty. Gerald, we'll need to review this immediately." Gerald's composure cracked, just enough for Mason to see the flicker of panic. Kara's eyes were locked on Mason, not with the ice of suspicion this time, but with something warmer, deeper. He'd disobeyed her direct order to stay out of company business, but she understood now. It wasn't defiance, it was loyalty. "I'm not signing anything," Kara said, pushing the document away. "Meeting adjourned." The board members gathered the evidence, murmuring among themselves as they left. Gerald glared at Mason, but with the tide shifting in the room, he had no move left except to follow them out. When the doors closed, the echo hung in the air. "You risked everything," Kara said quietly. Mason shrugged. "So did you. Guess we're both bad at playing it safe." For a long moment, neither spoke. The rain against the windows was the only sound. Then Kara's voice softened, almost a whisper. "Thank you." Mason looked at her, really looked, and realized that walking away had never been an option. The family courtroom was smaller than Mason expected, yet somehow it felt vast and merciless. The air smelled faintly of varnish and old paper, the quiet broken only by the shuffle of legal files and the occasional squeak of a chair. Ellie sat beside him at the plaintiff's table, swinging her feet under the bench. Her small hand gripped his so tightly that his knuckles whitened. He gave it a gentle squeeze. "You'll be okay, kiddo," he told himself. "No matter what happens to me, you'll be okay." Across the aisle, his ex-wife's attorney, a slick man in a navy suit, was already on his feet. "Your Honor," the lawyer began, voice sharp and calculated. "My client seeks full custody of her daughter, Ellie Cole. The father, while perhaps well-meaning, is currently employed in a menial capacity as domestic help for a billionaire, of all things. He is transient, without long-term financial stability. In short, he is a man living off the charity of others." Mason felt the sting, but kept his eyes forward. The lawyer pressed on. "We are not here to debate character, only capability. And the capability is lacking. He is a decorated veteran, yes, but war stories don't pay the bills, and they certainly don't raise a child." The judge, a silver-haired woman with a reputation for being unsentimental, scribbled a note. "Mr. Cole, your counsel will have a chance to respond. Please, continue." The attorney paced in front of the bench, voice rising just enough to carry an edge. "My client has a stable home, a steady income, and a support network. Mr. Cole offers—" "What?" "Long hours cleaning someone else's floors, uncertainty about his future, and an environment embroiled in corporate drama. Not the foundation for a child's upbringing." Every word felt like another brick on Mason's chest. His own lawyer, a graying man named Russo, stood. "Your Honor, if I may." But before he could speak, the back doors of the courtroom opened. The sound was small, just the click of hinges, but in the tense air, every head turned. Kara Kingsley wheeled herself in. She was dressed in a charcoal grey suit that seemed to absorb the light, her hair swept into a sleek chignon. The hush in the room was immediate. Everyone knew her face. The news had been full of her corporate battle in recent weeks. The judge's brows lifted. "Ms. Kingsley, you are—" "Kara Kingsley, Your Honor," she said, her voice steady. "CEO of Kingsley Innovations. I'm here as a witness for Mr. Mason Cole." The opposing attorney recovered quickly. "Your Honor, with all due respect, this seems highly irregular. Overruled," the judge said. "Proceed." Kara wheeled herself to the witness stand. The bailiff swore her in. When Russo approached for questioning, she didn't wait for a prompt. "Mr. Cole was hired into my household under circumstances most people would call impossible. I have a reputation for being difficult. No one lasted more than a day. Mason stayed. He stayed when the work was hard, when I pushed him away, when my home felt more like a mausoleum than a place to live." She looked directly at the judge. "He didn't just clean floors. He protected me from people who wanted to strip my company away. He uncovered a mole I'd trusted for years. And when I was at my lowest, he reminded me I still had something worth fighting for." Her eyes softened, and Mason felt an unfamiliar ache in his chest. "But more than that," Kara continued, "I watched him with Ellie. I watched how she lights up around him, how she trusts him completely. That little girl, she brought warmth into my home. She is the one bright light in a place that's been cold for far too long." The room was silent. Even the opposing lawyer had stopped shuffling his papers. Kara's voice dropped to a near whisper. "If you take her from him, Your Honor, you're not protecting her. You're taking away the one person who makes her feel safe, and speaking as someone who knows what it's like to live without that. Please, don't." For a long moment, the judge said nothing. She just studied Kara, then Mason, Then Ellie. Russo stepped back. No further questions. The opposing attorney tried to regain ground in cross-examination, but every question seemed smaller, more brittle, against the weight of what Kara had just said. When Kara left the stand, she passed Mason without looking directly at him, but her hand brushed the back of his for the briefest second. It was enough. The judge called a short recess. Mason sat in the quiet, Ellie's head leaning against his arm. He didn't know what the decision would be, but for the first time in weeks, he felt not alone. And that, in itself, was a victory. The verdict came down with a clean, resonant thud of the judge's gavel. Mason Cole will retain primary custody of his daughter, Ellie Cole. The words seemed to hang in the air for a moment before they sank in. Mason let out a slow breath, his shoulders easing for the first time in months. Ellie's small hand slid into his, and when he glanced down, her eyes were shining, pure relief and joy. He bent to whisper, "We did it, kiddo." But even as the warmth of victory spread through him, a strange heaviness sat in his chest. By the time they returned to Kara's estate that evening, the sky had turned the color of burnished copper. The house was quiet, too quiet. No staff lingering in the hallways, no clinking of glasses from the kitchen. Just the steady hum of the air conditioning and the muffled sound of Ellie's sneakers on marble. Mason had already decided this would be their last night here. He'd pack their bags after Ellie fell asleep, leave Kara a simple thank you note, and be gone before morning. She didn't need him anymore. He'd done his job, kept her safe, kept his daughter safe. Staying now would just make it harder when the inevitable came, when she realized he was nothing more than a temporary fix in a life far bigger than his own. When Kara found them in the sitting room, she was holding something small in her lap. She maneuvered her wheelchair closer, the faint squeak of the wheels the only sound breaking the hush. Ellie perked up immediately. "Hi, Miss Kara." Kara smiled faintly, then looked at Mason. "Do you have a moment?" He nodded, unsure. "Of course." She took a breath, her gaze moving between father and daughter. Then she reached into her lap and held out the carved wooden bird. Ellie's bird, the one Mason had given her months ago to make the house feel less cold. It looked almost the same as the day it had arrived, smooth grain polished by countless small hands, wings outstretched, as if caught in a moment of flight. Kara held it carefully, as though it might shatter. "This stayed on the shelf in my room," she said softly. "I didn't know why at first. I'm not sentimental about objects, but every time I looked at it, I didn't feel alone." Mason shifted uncomfortably, not trusting himself to speak. Kara extended the bird toward him. "I think it's yours." He reached to take it, but she didn't let go. Not yet. Instead, she turned to Ellie and gently placed the carving in the little girl's hands. "Ellie," Kara said, her voice lower now, "do you know what this is?" Ellie nodded. "A bird." Kara smiled faintly. "It's a reminder that family isn't just blood. Family is where someone stays, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." She glanced up at Mason. "Family is where someone doesn't walk away when the storms come." For a long moment, no one moved. The only sound was the slow tick of the grandfather clock in the corner. Mason felt something press hard in his chest, something that had nothing to do with pride or victory in a courtroom. It was the knowledge that she wasn't just talking to Ellie, she was talking to him. "I was planning to leave," Mason admitted, the words rough in his throat. "Didn't want to get in the way of your life." Kara's gaze didn't waver. "Maybe my life needs a little more getting in the way." Ellie looked between them, her eyes wide with a child's instinctive understanding. She clutched the bird to her chest. "So we can stay?" Mason hesitated only a second before answering. "Yeah, kiddo. We can stay." Something shifted in Kara's face then, not a smile exactly, but the faint, unguarded warmth of someone who had finally stopped bracing for loss. Outside, the coppery sky deepened into night. Inside, the three of them stood in the quiet, bound not by contracts or convenience, but by the fragile, stubborn truth Kara had just spoken aloud. Family was where you stayed. The kitchen was warm, in a way the rest of the house had never been before. Not because of the slow simmer of the chicken soup Kara had insisted on making herself, or the bread Mason had pulled from the oven, but because of something quieter, something that hummed beneath the surface. The three of them sat around the small wooden table, the one tucked into the corner where the morning light usually spilled in. Tonight, the light came from the amber glow of a single lamp above them, pooling on the table like a soft spotlight. Ellie was perched between them, her hair falling over her cheeks as she tore a piece of bread in two and offered half to Kara. Kara accepted it without hesitation, the faintest smile touching her lips before she dipped it into her soup. They didn't talk about the court case. They didn't talk about the company or the threats that had once loomed over this house like a gathering storm. They didn't talk about the future either, where they would go, what would happen next. Instead, they talked about nothing and everything. Ellie chattered about a bird she'd seen in the garden that morning. Mason teased her about how much soup she'd already eaten. And Kara, once the woman who measured her words like currency, actually laughed. It wasn't loud, it wasn't grand, but it was real. Halfway through the meal, Kara glanced toward the wooden bird now sitting on the windowsill, wings forever caught in mid-flight. Her gaze lingered there for a moment, before she looked back at Mason. "You know," she said softly, "I used to think staying was weakness, that the strongest people were the ones who could walk away without looking back." Mason met her eyes. And now, her smile deepened, just a little. "Now, I think the bravest thing a person can do is stay, especially when it's easier to leave." Ellie looked up from her bowl, catching only part of the exchange, but sensing more than she could fully understand. She reached out, small fingers slipping into Kara's on one side and Mason's on the other, as if to physically hold them together. They lingered long after the soup bowls were empty, the bread reduced to crumbs, the tea cooling in their cups. The air was unhurried, the kind that comes when no one is bracing for the next blow, the next loss. When it was time for Ellie to head upstairs, Mason stood to carry the dishes to the sink, but Kara's voice stopped him. "Mason." He turned. "Whatever comes next, you're not a guest here. You never were." He studied her for a moment, seeing the weight behind the words. Then he nodded once, the corners of his mouth tugging upward. Not the careful, guarded smile he'd worn for months, but something freer. Ellie darted back into the kitchen for one last hug goodnight, and in that small, ordinary gesture, Mason felt it, something shifting from survival into belonging. Outside, the night wrapped around the house, quiet and steady. Inside, three lives, once scattered, once certain they had no place together, now shared the same table, the same warmth, the same unspoken truth. Kindness isn't magic, but it can change the course of a life. Staying behind for someone who is left is the bravest act of all. Family is built on choice, not just blood. And for the first time in a long time, no one at that table felt alone.